I would never have thought that something like this could happen, but it has happened.
An 80-year-old pastor stands at the pulpit, then suddenly stops. He doesn't collapse, he doesn't explain. He just says, "Something like this has happened, and so it is." No scandal, no church conflict, no public sin. Yet the service ends early. The room goes silent, and the question no one wants to ask is this: if this has nothing to do with the church, then what is really happening? See this with your own eyes. Drop where you're watching from below and stick around with us. There's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's continue. Investigations don't begin with answers. They begin with gaps. Pastor Charles Lawson did something unusual that morning. He spoke, but he withheld. He acknowledged a crisis, yet refused to define it. And then he drew a clear boundary. This has nothing to do with the church. That single sentence removed an entire category of suspicion. No scandal, no internal conflict, no hidden controversy, which immediately forces a harder question into the open. If it wasn't the church, then where did the pressure come from? Notice what he did not do. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not hint at betrayal. He did not explain himself to protect his image. He stopped. In an era where leaders rush to control narratives, silence is not weakness. Silence is discipline. For decades, Pastor Lawson has been known for directness. When there is error, he confronts it. When there is truth, he names it. That's why this moment matters. A man who never avoids clarity chose restraint instead. That tells us something. Silence like this is rarely accidental. It is often protective. Protective of family, protective of dignity, protective of a line that should not be crossed publicly. And yet, by saying something happened, he confirmed that the pressure was real, personal, heavy enough to follow him into the pulpit. That combination, acknowledgement without disclosure, is not confusion, it's containment. And containment usually means the situation is ongoing, which raises another question many missed. If this struggle was strong enough to interrupt the service, how long had it already been there? Because crises don't arrive suddenly, they surface suddenly. And when they do, they leave behind clues, especially in what is left unsaid. When moments like this surface, the internet reacts fast. Clips circulate, opinions harden, assumptions spread, but patterns move slower. This was not the first time a faithful leader reached a breaking point without losing belief. History is full of moments like this, quiet, incomplete, easily misunderstood. The pattern is consistent. The collapse does not come after failure, it comes after endurance. In Scripture, Elijah calls fire down from heaven, public victory, clear authority, and then, without warning, he runs, he hides, he asks God to take his life, not because he doubted God, but because he was exhausted. That detail matters. Moses broke down under the weight of leadership long before the people did. Paul spoke openly about despairing of life itself. None of them abandoned truth. They reached the limits of capacity. That same pattern appears here. Pastor Lawson has spent decades confronting error, preaching without compromise, and resisting pressure to soften his message. That kind of consistency does not attract comfort. It attracts resistance. Not public resistance, private strain. And here is what most people miss. The enemy does not attack during weakness. He waits for obedience. He waits until a man has carried the weight long enough that silence becomes heavy and rest becomes thin. That is why moments like this don't look dramatic. They look restrained. They look quiet. They look unfinished. Because the battle didn't start that day. It simply became visible. And visibility always invites misinterpretation, unless you recognize the pattern. And once you do, the question changes. It's no longer what went wrong. It becomes, how long has this been costing him? And that question leads somewhere most people are not ready to go. If you're looking for the battlefield, don't start at the pulpit. Start at home. The enemy does not attack what's loud, he attacks what's vulnerable. That's a consistent pattern through Scripture and history. From Genesis to the life of every faithful leader, the first assault is always private, intimate, and invisible. Pastor Lawson's home, his sanctuary, his place of recovery, his space for honest prayer became the front line. That is not speculation. That is how spiritual conflict operates. Think about it. Where does a leader regain strength? Where do tears fall without titles? Where does prayer become raw, unfiltered, and honest? At home. And if peace there is disrupted, every sermon afterward becomes survival rather than overflow. It's subtle, it's strategic, and it's exhausting. Many overlook this. They celebrate the public moments, the sermons, the victories, the messages, but miss what happens behind closed doors. The disruption, the strain, the private wrestling with forces that cannot be named in the pulpit. And that is why Pastor Lawson's moment shocked people. They saw the service end abruptly. They heard almost nothing explained. They did not see the quiet battles that had been raging long before that morning. Here is the truth. When the home is under attack, it is not just a personal struggle. It is a spiritual indicator. It is a warning that the calling is being tested in the one place that fuels every public act. And yet, few are willing to acknowledge this. Few even know to look, which leads to the question everyone avoids asking. If the home is the first battlefield, what does that say about the unseen cost of every faithful ministry? Faithfulness comes at a price, and decades of obedience don't erase the cost, they compound it. Pastor Charles Lawson has spent a lifetime standing in the pulpit, preaching truth without compromise. That kind of consistency earns respect, but it also earns strain. Not in public, not in the messages delivered, but in private, where the weight accumulates quietly, almost invisibly. Every sermon, every confrontation with error, every moment of discipline adds to the ledger of spiritual exhaustion. It's not weakness that follows, it's weariness, a deep, invisible fatigue that does not always show on the outside. As a pastor grows older, the cumulative cost. Age is not the enemy, but endurance over decades reveals the limits of capacity. Even the strongest hearts can grow heavy under long-term pressure. And here is what most people overlook. Exhaustion is not the same as failure. Pastor Lawson did not lose his faith. He did not abandon his calling. He simply reached the edge of what could be carried silently. When spiritual warfare strikes, it loves this moment, the point where devotion is high, but energy is low. It targets the resting places, the moments meant for replenishment, knowing that a drained leader is less able to overflow to others. So when the service ended abruptly, it was not collapse. It was evidence of a prolonged campaign, battles fought in silence, victories unseen, prayers unanswered, all quietly pressing upon him. And it raises the inevitable tension. How long can one carry a calling under this weight before the private struggle bleeds into public perception? Because the next section will reveal exactly how that hidden strain translates into authority and why the church rarely notices it.
The church celebrates sermons. It celebrates victories. It celebrates the visible moments of faithfulness. But it rarely celebrates or even acknowledges the hidden battles that precede them. Pastor Lawson's experience exposes a truth most congregations overlook. The work of ministry is not only public, it begins at home, in rest, in prayer, in private endurance. That is where authority is forged, tested, and sometimes broken temporarily, not visibly, but spiritually. Many people expect pastors to be unshakable, perfect, imperturbable, but the Scripture never promises that. What it does promise is faithfulness under strain, and strain is messy, strain is hidden, strain is rarely spoken aloud. This is why the silence in Pastor Lawson's service drew attention, not because he had failed, but because the reality of sustained spiritual warfare rarely surfaces in the pulpit. The audience applauds sermons. Few witness the private exhaustion that fuels them. And there is a subtle danger in that oversight. When churches ignore the unseen cost, they inadvertently demand more than can be given. They judge moments like this as weakness or scandal, rather than understanding them as war reports, signs that the calling is still vital, still under attack, still demanding vigilance. Most people never pause to ask, how is this pastor managing his household? How is his peace maintained or disrupted? Because if that foundation falters, the public ministry feels heavy. Not because of failure, not because of sin, but because spiritual warfare targets the source of strength first. And just as you begin to recognize this pattern, another unsettling truth emerges. The enemy doesn't wait for mistakes to strike. It strikes where obedience is strongest. Which leads to the next question. What does the intensity of this battle reveal about his calling? The moment ended abruptly. The room was still. The music began, not to celebrate, but to fill the silence. And yet, what actually happened that morning is only the beginning of the story. Pastor Lawson did not collapse. He did not quit. He did not abandon the pulpit or the calling that has defined decades of his life. What he did was something harder. He exposed the unseen cost of faithfulness in real time. Few noticed the subtle details, how his voice faltered when speaking about personal struggle, how his pauses stretched longer than normal, how even the congregation sensed something fragile yet refused to break under it. These are not mistakes. They are evidence of private battles, battles the public rarely witnesses. And yet the tension lingers, because battles like this never stay confined. They creep into decisions, into relationships, into moments of leadership that everyone assumes are simple. The home becomes the front line. Strength is tested in private. Authority is forged quietly. And when one moment erupts into visibility, it leaves questions hanging. How long has this been unfolding behind closed doors? How much strain has accumulated over decades? And perhaps most importantly, what will happen when the next visible moment tests endurance once again? Pastor Lawson's moment was not just a service interrupted. It was a warning, a report, a signal that obedience carries weight, and that those who observe only the pulpit will miss the story entirely. And as we consider what comes next, one thing is clear. The battle is far from over, and the next revelation may arrive where no one expects it. We have seen the service end abruptly. We have seen silence take the place of words. We have seen a man who carries decades of ministry choose restraint over explanation. But what comes next is uncertain, and that is exactly the point. Pastor Lawson's struggle did not begin in the pulpit. It did not begin with sermons or public conflict. It began in the spaces no one sees, the home, the quiet room, the moments where prayer is raw and tears fall unnoticed. That is the true battleground, and it does not wait for visibility. No one knows what unseen pressures remain. No one can predict when the next strain will arrive. And the most important question is not whether he will speak again. It is whether the church, the public, and even the faithful observers will recognize the war behind his words. Because spiritual warfare is patient. It does not strike for headlines. It does not attack for applause. It strikes where strength is cultivated, where obedience is most consistent, and where disruption can quietly erode endurance. And Pastor Lawson is still standing, still preaching, still serving. But every observer must ask, how much longer before the private struggle becomes visible again? How long can obedience be carried in silence before it demands a public reckoning? The story is not over. The battle is ongoing, and the next chapter, unseen, unspoken, yet inevitable, may arrive when everyone believes the moment has passed. So the question remains, what is really happening behind the pulpit, and who will see it when it strikes next?